Shard Crown. Eowyn Aldrich had never belonged to warmth, though warmth had tried to claim her. But when the first frost came in midsummer, when the trees bowed under the weight of unseen hands, she felt it something waking, something waiting. The wind curled around her, not in warning, but in recognition. And at the center of the storm, he stood silver-eyed, watching her with quiet possession. "You were never meant to be theirs," he murmured. "You were meant for me." Chapter 1. The Unseasonable Frost. The air, thick and humid with the promise of a late July thunderstorm, pressed down on Eowyn Aldrich. It was the kind of day that made the back of your neck prickle, the kind where the sky held its breath, waiting. She stood on the porch of her small cottage, nestled on the outskirts of Havenwood, a town as sleepy and unremarkable as its name suggested. The garden, usually riotous with color, seemed subdued, the vibrant blooms drooping under the oppressive weight of the impending storm. Eowyn, with her 57 years etched softly around her kind eyes and the silver threading through her auburn braid, found a strange comfort in the stillness. It mirrored the quiet hum of her own life, a life lived in the gentle rhythm of routine since her husband, Thomas, had passed 5 years prior. She'd been watering the petunias, their velvety petals thirsty for the rain that wouldn't come, when the first shiver ran down her spine. It wasn't the chill of a coming storm, but something deeper, a bone-deep cold that settled in her marrow. The air, moments before heavy and still, began to stir. Not with the gusting prelude to a downpour, but with a focused, almost deliberate movement. It swirled around her, a personal vortex in the otherwise undisturbed atmosphere. Eowyn frowned, her hand instinctively going to the small, silver locket she wore, a gift from Thomas on their 20th anniversary. Inside, a faded picture of him, his eyes crinkling at the corners, smiled back at her. The silver felt unusually cold against her skin. Then she saw it. A delicate tracery of frost, spider webbing across the vibrant green leaves of her rose bushes. Frost. In July. The petunias, moments ago drooping, now stood rigid, their petals rimmed with a glittering, unnatural white. The air grew sharper, the scent of impending rain replaced by a clean, almost metallic tang, like the breath of a winter wind. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Eowyn's usual calm. This wasn't right. This wasn't natural. She'd lived in Havenwood her entire life, had known its rhythms, its seasons, as intimately as she knew the lines on her own hands. This was something else entirely. The wind intensified, whipping her braid around her face. She could hear the rustling of leaves, not the frantic flapping of a summer storm, but a crisp, crackling sound, like dry leaves skittering across frozen ground. The roses, now encased in ice, looked like exquisite, deadly sculptures. Eowyn backed away, her hand still clutching the locket. Her breath hitched in her throat, forming small, white puffs in the suddenly frigid air. The temperature had plummeted, dropping with an unnatural speed that defied logic, defied the season, defied everything she knew. She stumbled back, her heel catching on the edge of the porch. She reached out, her hand grasping for the wooden railing, but her fingers brushed against something impossibly cold. Ice. The railing, moments before warm and weathered wood, was now coated in a thick layer of frost, sharp and unforgiving. A low groan echoed from the woods bordering her property. Not the creak of old trees in the wind, but something deeper, something alive. It resonated with the cold, with the unnatural frost, with the growing sense of unease that had taken root deep in Eowyn's soul. She turned her head, slowly, fear a tight knot in her stomach. The woods, usually a comforting presence, now seemed menacing, the shadows between the trees deeper, more opaque than they should be. The air shimmered, distorted, as if the very fabric of reality was fraying at the edges. And then, the wind spoke. Not in words, not in a language she could understand, but in a feeling, a sensation, a knowing that settled deep within her. It was a recognition, a calling, a sense of inevitability that chilled her more than the ice that was rapidly consuming her garden. It was a feeling of being seen, of being chosen, of being claimed. Eowyn closed her eyes, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This wasn't just a storm. This was something more. Something ancient, something powerful, something that had been sleeping and had now, inexplicably, awakened. And it was focused, with terrifying intensity, on her. When she opened them, the world was a blur of white and green, the frost spreading with alarming speed, consuming everything in its path. And in the heart of it, a figure began to coalesce, blurred at first, then sharp, brought to a strange and terrible reality in front of her. Chapter 2. Whispers on the Wind. The figure solidified, emerging from the swirling frost and wind like a being sculpted from ice and shadow. He was tall, strikingly so, his presence dominating the small, rapidly freezing garden. His hair was the color of freshly fallen snow, stark against the deep green of the encroaching woods, and it fell around his shoulders in a way that seemed both wild and meticulously controlled. But it was his eyes that held Eowyn captive. They were silver, not the soft, warm silver of her locket, but a piercing, glacial silver, like the heart of a winter storm. They held a depth of knowledge, of ancient power, that made her breath catch in her throat. He was dressed in clothes that seemed both archaic and strangely timeless. Dark furs, layered over what looked like leather and intricately woven cloth, spoke of a world far removed from Havenwood's quiet simplicity. A large, silver clasp, shaped like a stylized wolf's head, fastened the furs at his shoulder. He exuded an aura of controlled power, a stillness that was more intimidating than any overt display of strength. Eowyn stood frozen, not just from the cold, but from a primal fear that had taken root deep within her. She wanted to run, to scream, to break the unnatural spell that seemed to have fallen over her garden, over her life. But she couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her gaze locked with his, her mind struggling to reconcile the reality of his presence with the quiet, predictable world she had always known. The wind, which had been a chaotic force, now seemed to circle them both, a silent, watchful presence. It carried with it a faint whisper, a murmuring that seemed to brush against Eowyn's mind, not quite forming words, but conveying a sense of waiting. He took a step closer, the frost crunching softly beneath his boots. The sound, small as it was, seemed to shatter the silence, breaking the spell that had held Eowyn captive. She flinched, a small, involuntary movement, but he didn't seem to notice. His gaze remained fixed on her, intense and unwavering. "Eowyn Aldrich," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate with the same otherworldly energy as the wind. It wasn't a question, but a statement, a confirmation of something he already knew. Hearing her name, spoken with such possession, sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. It was a name she hadn't heard spoken with anything other than gentle affection or polite indifference in years. This was different.
Who are you?"
She managed to whisper, her voice trembling. The words felt inadequate, foolish even, in the face of such an overwhelming presence. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if considering her question, or perhaps considering her. The movement was subtly predatory, like a wolf assessing its prey. "I am the one you have been waiting for," he finally said, his voice laced with a certainty that bordered on arrogance. "The one the wind has whispered of. The one the frost has heralded." His words made no sense, yet, on some deeper, instinctive level, they resonated with a chilling truth. The whispers on the wind, the unnatural frosted, had all been leading to this, to him. Eowyn shook her head, trying to dispel the unsettling feeling of familiarity that was creeping over her. I don't understand. I haven't been waiting for anyone." He cut her off with a slight, almost imperceptible movement of his hand. The wind, as if responding to his silent command, stilled for a moment, the whispering fading into silence. "You may not have known it," he said, his silver eyes holding hers captive, "but your soul has. It has been calling to me, across the years, across the realms." And now I have answered. The word realms hung in the air, a stark reminder of the supernatural nature of this encounter. Eowyn's mind reeled. This was madness. This was a dream, a hallucination brought on by the impending storm, by grief, by loneliness. It had to be. And yet, the cold was undeniably real. The frost, spreading across her garden with unnatural speed, was real. And he, standing before her, radiating an aura of ancient power and undeniable magnetism, was undeniably, terrifyingly real. He took another step closer, closing the distance between them. Eowyn could feel the cold emanating from him, a palpable wave that washed over her, stealing her breath. She could smell him, to a clean, sharp scent, like pine needles and winter air, overlaid with something wilder, something untamed. You were never meant to be theirs, he murmured, his voice low and intimate, as if they were sharing a secret. His gaze dropped, for the briefest of moments, to the silver locket she still clutched in her hand. You were meant for me. His words, spoken with such quiet intensity, struck a chord deep within her, a chord she hadn't known existed. A flicker of something other than fear, a strange, unsettling sense of recognition sparked within her. And then he reached for her. Chapter 3. The Silver-Eyed Stranger. His hand, large and strong, moved with a deliberate slowness that did nothing to lessen the apprehension coiling in Eowyn's stomach. The leather of his glove, dark and supple, brushed against her cheek as he reached out, not to grab, but to trace. His touch, despite the barrier of the glove, sent a jolt of unexpected warmth through her, a stark contrast to the frigid air surrounding them. It was a warmth that shouldn't have been possible, coming from him, from this creature of ice and shadow, yet it was undeniably there, a flicker of heat against the encroaching cold. Eowyn gasped, her eyes widening. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath until she released it in a shaky sigh. Her mind, still reeling from the impossibility of the situation, struggled to reconcile the fear with this unexpected sensation. His fingertip, tracing the line of her jaw, lingered for a moment at the corner of her mouth, before moving down to brush lightly against the silver locket. The metal, which had been chillingly cold moments before, now warmed under his touch, radiating a gentle heat that seeped into her skin. This, he murmured, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate with the same otherworldly energy as the wind, is a trinket of a forgotten life. A life that was never truly yours. His gaze met hers again, and Eowyn found herself lost in the depths of those silver eyes. They held a knowledge that seemed to stretch back centuries, a sadness that echoed something deep within her own soul. She saw a flicker of something there, too, of vulnerability that belied his powerful, almost intimidating presence. It was a glimpse, fleeting and quickly masked, but it was enough to make her question, for the briefest of moments, the fear that had gripped her. I don't understand, she repeated, her voice stronger this time, though still laced with uncertainty. Thomas, he was my husband. My life. He withdrew his hand, the warmth fading with its absence, leaving a lingering chill in its wake. He looked at the locket, still dangling from her trembling fingers, with an expression that bordered on disdain. A fleeting moment, he said, his voice hardening slightly. A temporary solace in a world that was never meant to hold you. You are more than this, Eowyn Aldrich. More than you know. He stepped back, giving her space, though the intensity of his gaze never wavered. The wind, which had been still, began to swirl again, picking up the scent of frost and pine, and something wilder, something that resonated with the unsettling power that emanated from him. What am I, then? She asked, the question a whisper lost in the rising wind. She felt a strange pull, a yearning for answers she didn't even know she was seeking. He smiled then, a slow, predatory smile that sent a shiver down her spine, despite the flicker of warmth his touch had ignited. It was a smile that promised both danger and something else. Something that drew her in, even as it terrified her. You are Frostborn, he said, the word spoken with a reverence that made it sound like a title, a destiny. A daughter of the North Wind, a child of the ancient ice. You are mine. The word mine hung in the air, heavy with implication. It wasn't a declaration of ownership, not in the way she understood it. It was something deeper, something more primal, a claim that resonated with the unnatural cold, with the whispers on the wind, with the unsettling sense of recognition that had been growing within her. Ioan shook her head, trying to deny the truth of his words, even as a part of her, a long dormant part, stirred in response. That's impossible.
I'm just Ioan. I'm ordinary.
He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to echo from the surrounding woods. Ordinary?
No, Eowyn.
You are anything but. You have been hidden, sheltered, kept from your true nature. But the frost it remembers. The wind it knows. And I have come to reclaim what is rightfully mine. He gestured around them, at the frozen garden, at the ice-covered porch, at the encroaching winter that had consumed her summer day.
This is not a curse, Ioan.
This is an awakening. This is you. Ioan looked around, her heart pounding in her chest. The familiar landscape of her garden was now alien, transformed into a scene of breathtaking, terrifying beauty. The roses, encased in ice, glittered like diamonds in the fading light. The frost, spreading across the lawn, sparkled with an ethereal glow. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also wrong. And yet, a part of her, a part she hadn't known existed, felt a strange sense of belonging, a connection to the cold, to the power, to the wildness that emanated from the silver-eyed stranger. She saw her reflection in the glass of a nearby window, distorted by the layer of frost. A woman with silver streaking her auburn hair and something new flickering in her eyes. Something wild. He took a step toward her, his eyes holding her gaze. Come with me, Ioan Aldrich, he said, his voice a low, persuasive murmur. Let me show you who you truly are. Let me show you your destiny. His hand, gloved in dark leather, was outstretched, an invitation, a command, a promise. Ioan stared at it, her mind a battlefield of fear and a strange, unsettling yearning. To go with him meant abandoning everything she knew, everything she held dear. But to stay meant denying a part of herself that, until this moment, she hadn't even known existed. She looked to the silver locket, then back to his outstretched hand, the ice forming around its edges. Chapter 4. A Pact Made in Ice. Ioan's gaze lingered on his outstretched hand, the dark leather a stark contrast to the pristine white of the frost that continued to creep across her garden, across her life. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Fear, yes, a primal, instinctive terror of the unknown, of the power that radiated from this strange, compelling man. But there was something else, too. A flicker of curiosity, a spark of recognition, a yearning for something she couldn't name, something that had been dormant within her for so long, awakened by the unnatural frost, by the whispers on the wind, by him. Her hand, trembling slightly, moved almost involuntarily, drawn towards his. The silver locket, still clutched in her other hand, felt heavy, a tangible reminder of the life she had known, the life she was on the verge of leaving behind. She thought of Thomas, of his gentle smile, of the quiet comfort of their shared life. The memory, usually a source of solace, now felt like a chain, binding her to a past that was rapidly fading in the face of this overwhelming present. She hesitated, her fingertips inches from his glove. The silence stretched, broken only by the crisp crackling of the frost and the low hum of the wind, which seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for her decision. He didn't move, didn't speak. His silver eyes remained fixed on her, patient, unwavering, as if he knew the turmoil raging within her, as if he knew the outcome. There was a confidence in his stillness, a certainty that bordered on arrogance, yet there was also something else. A flicker of vulnerability, perhaps, or a hint of longing. Ioan took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. She looked at her garden, once a haven of vibrant color, now transformed into a breathtaking, terrifying landscape of ice and snow. She looked at the house, her home, filled with memories of a life that now seemed distant, unreal. And then, She looked back at him, at the silver-eyed stranger who claimed she was frostborn, a daughter of the north wind, a child of the ancient ice. If I go with you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind, "what happens to Havenwood? To my home?" He tilted his head slightly, a gesture that seemed almost thoughtful. "Havenwood will remain," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Untouched, unharmed. As for your home," he paused, his gaze softening slightly. "It will be as you left it, a memory preserved in time. Until, or if you choose to return." The words offered a small measure of comfort, a reassurance that she wasn't completely severing her ties to the life she had known. But the underlying implication that she might never return sent a fresh wave of fear through her. "And what will you show me?" she asked, the question a plea for understanding, for reassurance, for something to anchor her in this swirling vortex of uncertainty. He smiled then, a slow, captivating smile that transformed his face, softening the harsh lines, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath the icy exterior. It was a smile that promised both danger and adventure. "I will show you the world as it truly is," he said, his voice laced with a seductive power. "A world of magic, of ancient power, of forgotten realms. I will show you your heritage, your birthright, your destiny. I will show you yourself." His words resonated with something deep within her, a longing for something more, something beyond the quiet, predictable life she had always known. It was a dangerous longing, a reckless yearning, but it was there, undeniable, pulling her towards him, towards the unknown. She made her decision. It wasn't a conscious choice, not really. It was more of a surrender, a yielding to the inevitable, to the force that had been set in motion the moment the first frost appeared on her rose bushes. Her hand, trembling no longer, reached out and grasped his. The contact sent a jolt of energy through her, a surge of power that was both exhilarating and terrifying. It was a warmth, yes, but a warmth infused with the cold, a strange, paradoxical sensation that made her breath catch in her throat. His grip tightened, not painfully, but possessively, a silent confirmation of the pact they had just made. The wind roared, swirling around them in a furious vortex, whipping her hair around her face, obscuring her vision. The frost intensified, spreading outwards from their joined hands, engulfing the garden, the house, the entire world in a blinding white. Yoan closed her eyes, bracing herself for she didn't know what. She felt a sensation of falling, of being lifted, of being transported, not physically, but spiritually. It was as if her very essence was being pulled from her body, drawn into the swirling vortex of ice and wind. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The wind died down, the frost receded, the blinding white faded, revealing not her garden, not Havenwood, but a landscape utterly alien, utterly breathtaking. She stood on a snow-covered cliff, overlooking a vast, frozen valley. Towering mountains, their peaks shrouded in mist, pierced the sky. The air was crisp and clean, biting at her exposed skin, yet she felt strangely invigorated, alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. He was still holding her hand, his grip a reassuring presence in this unfamiliar world. He released her, slowly, reluctantly, as if breaking a physical bond. He turned to her, his silver eyes reflecting the otherworldly landscape, and a smile, genuine this time, played on his lips. And there, in the heart of this frozen wasteland, Eowyn saw a glimmer of the place she was now to call home. The fear was not yet entirely gone, but it was ebbing, replaced by the first tendrils of some other emotion.
Hope.
Chapter 5. The Abandoned Village. The air bit at Eowyn's cheeks, a stark contrast to the humid July day that felt like a lifetime ago. Yet, despite the chill, she felt a strange sense of exhilaration, a feeling of being awake after years of slumber. The landscape before her, a vast expanse of snow and ice, was both terrifying and breathtakingly beautiful.
Where are we?"
she asked, her voice a little breathless, her gaze sweeping across the frozen valley below. "We are in the Whisperwind Valley," he replied, his voice a low rumble that seemed to blend with the wind. "A place forgotten by time, hidden from the eyes of mortals. A sanctuary and a prison." The last word, spoken with a hint of bitterness, sent a shiver down Eowyn's spine. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for answers. He, in turn, only met her gaze, his silver eyes holding a depth of emotion she couldn't quite decipher. "A prison?" she echoed, her voice a whisper. He nodded, his gaze shifting back to the valley. "For those who are different. For those who do not belong in the world of men. For the Frostborn." He gestured towards a cluster of buildings nestled in the valley below, barely visible through the swirling snow. They looked ancient, their roofs covered in a thick layer of white, their walls weathered and worn. Smoke curled from a few of the chimneys, a sign of life in this otherwise desolate landscape. "That was Aliana," he said, his voice laced with a sadness that resonated with Un. "A village of Frostborn. Once a thriving community, now mostly abandoned." Eowyn's heart ached at the sight. There was a poignant beauty to the village, a sense of resilience in the face of overwhelming isolation. But there was also a profound sense of loss, a feeling of something precious that had been broken, perhaps irreparably. "What would happen?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. He hesitated, his gaze clouding over, as if he were reliving a painful memory. "The world changed," he finally said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "The balance shifted. The old ways were forgotten, feared. The Frostborn were hunted. Many were killed. Others fled. Only a few remain." The word hunted sent a chill down Eowyn's spine, a stark reminder of the danger that she, as a newly awakened Frostborn, now faced. She instinctively moved closer to him, seeking the warmth and protection that he seemed to emanate, despite his icy exterior. He seemed to sense her fear, and he placed a reassuring hand on her arm. The touch, through the layers of her clothing and his glove, sent a jolt of warmth through her, a familiar comfort in this unfamiliar world. "Do not worry," he said, his voice softening. "You are safe here. I will protect you." His words, spoken with such certainty, offered a small measure of comfort. But Eowyn couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. The abandoned village, the story of the hunted Frostborn, the sense of isolation, it all painted a picture of a world far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. They began to descend towards the village, the snow crunching softly beneath their boots. The wind whipped around them, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke and something else. Something ancient, something magical, something that resonated with the awakening power within Eowyn. As they drew closer, she could see more details of the village. The buildings were made of stone and wood, their architecture simple yet elegant, reflecting a deep connection to the surrounding landscape. Some were in ruins, their roofs collapsed, their walls crumbling. Others, though weathered, appeared to be intact, their windows dark and empty, their doors closed tight against the cold. They passed a small, frozen-over well, its wooden bucket hanging askew. A carved stone marker stood beside it, its inscription covered in snow. Eowyn reached out, brushing away the snow with her gloved hand. The inscription, written in a language she didn't recognize, yet somehow understood, read, "Here lies the heart of Aliana. May its spirit endure." A wave of sadness washed over Eowyn. She felt a connection to this place, to these people, to their lost history. It was a connection she couldn't explain, yet it was there, undeniable, a part of her newly awakened heritage. They reached the edge of the village, entering a narrow, snow-covered street. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the wind and the occasional creak of a weathered sign. Eowyn felt a sense of expectation, as if the village itself were holding its breath, waiting for something or someone. He stopped before a building that was larger than the others, its wooden door intricately carved with images of wolves and snowflakes. A faint light flickered from within, casting a warm glow onto the snow-covered ground. "This is where I stay," he said, his voice low. It is not much, but it is safe. He turned to look at her. She was smaller than him, yet that feeling of strength was emanating stronger. He hesitated. He opened the door and stepped aside, waiting. Chapter 6. Echoes of a Forgotten Past. The interior of the building was a stark contrast to the desolate, snow-swept exterior. A fire crackled merrily in a large stone hearth, casting a warm, inviting glow over the room. The air was filled with the scent of wood smoke and herbs, a comforting aroma that eased some of Eowyn's lingering apprehension. The room was sparsely furnished, but with a rustic elegance that spoke of a bygone era. A large, wooden table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by several sturdy chairs. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books, scrolls, and various objects that Eowyn couldn't quite identify. A thick, woven rug covered the floor, providing a welcome layer of warmth beneath her feet. He closed the door behind them, shutting out the cold and the wind, creating a sense of sanctuary, of enclosure. He removed his heavy furs, revealing a tunic of dark, woven cloth and leather trousers. The firelight flickered across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the intensity of his silver eyes. Eowyn remained standing near the door, her hands clasped in front of her, feeling a little awkward, a little out of place. She had traded her familiar, comfortable cottage for this ancient, mysterious dwelling, filled with echoes of a forgotten past. He gestured towards the fire. "Come," he said, his voice softer now, devoid of the commanding tone he had used earlier. "Warm yourself. You must be cold." She hesitated for a moment, then slowly approached the hearth, drawn by the warmth and the inviting glow. She held her hands out to the flames, feeling the heat seep into her chilled fingers. The firelight danced in her eyes, reflecting the flickering emotions within her: fear, curiosity, and a growing sense of wonder. He moved around the room, lighting several candles, their flames adding to the warm, golden light. He seemed to know his way around instinctively, his movements fluid and graceful, despite his size and the archaic clothing he wore. This was a gathering place," he said, his voice breaking the silence. He gestured towards the large table and the shelves filled with books. "For the Frostborn of Aliana. A place to share stories, to learn, to remember." Eowyn looked around the room, her gaze lingering on the books, the scrolls, the strange objects that lined the shelves. She felt a pull, a yearning to know more about this place, about these people, about her own newly discovered heritage. Can I look?" she asked, her voice a little hesitant. He nodded. "Of course. Everything here is yours, as much as it is mine." His words, spoken with a quiet generosity, surprised her. She had expected him to be possessive, guarded, even hostile. But he seemed genuinely willing to share this place, this history with her. She approached one of the shelves, her fingers tracing the spines of the ancient books. They were bound in leather, their titles written in the same language she had seen on the stone marker in the village, the language she somehow understood, despite never having seen it before. She pulled one of the books from the shelf, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. She carefully opened it, revealing intricate drawings of plants, animals, and people. People with the same silver eyes as him, people wielding a power that seemed to emanate from the very pages of the book. These are the Frostborn?" she asked, her voice filled with awe. He nodded, coming to stand beside her. He pointed to one of the drawings, a depiction of a woman with long, flowing white hair, holding a staff that seemed to be made of ice. "That is Lyra," he said, his voice laced with a reverence that made Eowyn's heart ache. "The first Frostborn, the one who brought the gift and the curse to our people." The word curse sent a shiver down Eowyn's spine. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for answers. What curse?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, his gaze clouding over, as if he were wrestling with a painful memory. "The curse of isolation," he finally said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "The curse of being different. The curse of being feared." He closed the book, his hand lingering on the cover, as if he were drawing strength from the past. He turned to Eowyn, his silver eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored her own. He moved to a smaller table position near the window and began to pour liquid from a dark, earthenware jug into 2 wooden cups. The steam rose from the cups, giving off an herbal aroma. He handed one to her. She took it carefully and sipped. It was a warm tea that spread throughout her. "We are not meant to live in the shadows," he said, his voice low and intense. "We are not meant to be hunted, to be feared. We are meant to thrive, to embrace our power, to remember." He watched as she finished the tea, and the color returned to her face. He felt something stir in him, and for the first time since that day, he felt a sense of hope. He had to show her. Chapter 7. The Mark of the Frostborn. He set down his own cup, the untouched liquid steaming gently in the firelight. The silence that fell between them was not uncomfortable, but rather charged with a sense of unspoken questions, of shared emotions. Yoan, too, had placed her cup on the small table, her fingers tracing the rim of the rough wood, her mind still grappling with the revelations of the past hour. "There is more, isn't there?" she asked, her voice soft, her gaze meeting his across the room. "More to the curse, more to the Frostborn, more to me." He nodded, his silver eyes holding hers captive. "Yes," he said, his voice a low rumble. "There is much more. And it is time you knew." He approached her, his movements slow and deliberate, his presence filling the small space between them. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, a warmth that seemed to defy the icy nature of his heritage. "The Frostborn are not merely different," he said, his voice laced with a quiet intensity. "We are marked, bound to the north wind, to the ancient ice, by a power that is both a gift and a burden." He reached out, his hand hovering over her left arm, just above her wrist. Yoan instinctively flinched, a flicker of apprehension in her eyes.
"May I?"
he asked, his voice gentle, his gaze searching hers for permission. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. He carefully pushed up the sleeve of her sweater, revealing the pale skin of her forearm. The firelight flickered across her skin, highlighting the delicate tracery of blue veins beneath the surface. Yoan held her breath, waiting, unsure of what to expect. He touched her then, his fingertips, bare this time, tracing a line along her inner wrist. The contact sent a jolt of energy through her, not painful, but intense. A sensation of cold, yes, but also of awakening. As his fingers moved, a faint, shimmering pattern began to appear on her skin. It was a delicate tracery of silver, like frost crystals forming on a window pane. The pattern grew, spreading outwards from the point of his touch, forming intricate shapes, symbols she didn't recognize, yet somehow knew. Yoan gasped, her eyes widening in surprise and awe. The mark was beautiful, ethereal, a visible manifestation of the power that had been awakened within her. It felt alive, pulsing with a gentle energy that resonated with her very being. "This," he said, his voice a low murmur, "is the mark of the Frostborn, the sign of your heritage, your connection to the ancient power. It is unique to each of us, a reflection of our soul." He withdrew his hand, and the mark, though still visible, seemed to fade slightly, as if retreating beneath the surface of her skin. The sensation of cold had subsided, replaced by a lingering warmth, a tingling awareness of the power that now flowed within her. Yoan stared at her arm, her fingers tracing the delicate lines of the mark. It was a tangible reminder of her new identity, of the world she had entered, of the destiny she was now bound to. What does it mean?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of wonder and apprehension. He smiled, a slow, captivating smile that transformed his face. "It means you are one of us," he said, his voice laced with a quiet pride. "It means you are powerful. It means you are not alone." The last words, spoken with such tenderness, resonated deeply with Owen. She had spent so many years feeling alone, even before Thomas's death. The quiet isolation of her life in Havenwood had been a constant companion, a subtle ache that she had learned to live with. But now, Standing here, in this ancient dwelling, with the mark of the Frostborn shimmering on her skin, she felt a connection, a belonging, that she hadn't known was possible. "But what do I do?" she asked, her gaze shifting from her arm to his face. "I don't know anything about this. About being Frostborn." He stepped back, giving her space, though his gaze remained fixed on her. "You will learn," he said, his voice reassuring. "I will teach you. We will explore your power, your heritage, your destiny, together." The word together hung in the air, heavy with implication. It was a promise, a commitment, a bond that had been forged in ice and sealed with the mark of the Frostborn. He moved to retrieve a heavy cloak, lined with a familiar fur, and draped it over her. "It will take time," he said softly. "Time and patience."
Trust.
He met her eyes, and Eowyn saw again the warmth he kept so carefully guarded. "But tonight," he said, "we hunt." Chapter 8. The Hunter's Pursuit. The word hunt sent a shiver down Eowyn's spine, a mixture of fear and excitement. The concept was both alien and strangely familiar, resonating with the wildness that had been awakened within her. She wrapped the heavy cloak tighter around her, the fur a comforting weight against the chill night air.
Hunt what?
She asked, her voice a little breathless, her gaze searching his face for answers. He smiled, a slow, predatory smile that sent a flicker of heat through her, despite the fear. "Not what," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Whom?" His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Eowyn's mind raced, trying to comprehend the danger that they were about to face. Who are we hunting?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, his silver eyes clouding over, as if he were wrestling with a difficult decision. "Those who hunt us," he finally said, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "Those who fear the Frostborn. Those who seek to extinguish our flame. The hunters." The word, unspoken until now, resonated with a chilling familiarity. He had mentioned them before, in the context of the abandoned village, of the lost history of the Frostborn. Now, they were no longer an abstract threat, but a tangible, immediate danger. Eowyn's heart pounded in her chest. She was no warrior, no hunter. She was a woman who had lived a quiet, sheltered life, a life of gardening and gentle routines. The thought of facing armed opponents, of engaging in a fight for her very survival, was terrifying. He seemed to sense her fear, and he placed a reassuring hand on her arm. The touch, through the thick layers of the cloak and his glove, sent a jolt of warmth through her, a familiar comfort in this increasingly dangerous world. "Do not worry," he said, his voice softening. "I will not let them harm you. I will protect you always." His words, spoken with such unwavering certainty, offered a small measure of comfort. But Eowyn couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. She knew, instinctively, that this was not just a simple hunt, but a test, a trial by fire that would determine her fate, her future as a Frostborn. They left the warmth and safety of the dwelling, stepping out into the frigid night air. The wind whipped around them, carrying with it the scent of snow and pine, and something else. Something metallic, something menacing. "They are close," he said, his voice low and alert, his gaze scanning the surrounding landscape. "They have been tracking us since Havenwood." Eowyn's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't realized that they were in such immediate danger. She had thought that the journey to the Whisperwind Valley had been an escape, a sanctuary. But now, it seemed, the danger had followed them, clinging to them like a shadow. They moved quickly, silently, through the snow-covered streets of the abandoned village. The moon, full and bright, cast long, eerie shadows across the landscape, making it difficult to distinguish between reality and illusion. Eowyn stayed close to him, her senses on high alert, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Suddenly, he stopped, his body tensing, his hand reaching for the large, silver knife that was sheathed at his side. Eowyn followed his gaze, her eyes straining to see through the darkness. There, in the distance, she saw them. Figures, silhouetted against the snow, moving towards them with a purposeful stride. They were armed, their weapons glinting in the moonlight. The hunters. "Stay behind me," he whispered, his voice tight with command. "And do not use your power.
Not yet.
It is too dangerous." Eowyn nodded, her throat too dry to speak. She trusted him, instinctively, to protect her. But she also knew that she couldn't rely on him forever. She had to learn to defend herself, to harness the power that flowed within her, to become a true Frostborn. He moved forward, his body a shield between her and the approaching hunters. The wind whipped around them, a furious vortex of snow and ice, as if the very elements were responding to the impending conflict. The hunters drew closer, their faces now visible in the moonlight. They were grim, determined, their eyes filled with a cold hatred that sent a shiver down Eowyn's spine. The first hunter raised his weapon, a crossbow, its bolt aimed directly at him. Eowyn gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She wanted to scream, to warn him, but she couldn't. She was frozen, paralyzed by fear. He turned, in what seemed like slow motion to Eowyn, and in that moment, the moon went behind the clouds. Chapter 9. Sanctuary in the Ruins. The sudden darkness, absolute and disorienting, swallowed the scene whole. Eowyn's gasp was lost in the rising wind, a howl that mirrored the turmoil in her heart. She heard the thwack of the crossbow, the sickening thud of the bolt finding its mark, not in flesh and bone, but in something else. A roar, primal and filled with rage, echoed through the abandoned village. It was his voice, but transformed, amplified, imbued with a power that made the very ground beneath Eowyn's feet tremble. She couldn't see, but she could feel. The air crackled with energy, a palpable force that pressed against her skin. The temperature plummeted, dropping with an unnatural speed that made her teeth chatter. The scent of pine and snow intensified, overlaid with the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. She heard the sounds of struggle, the clash of metal, the grunts of men, the terrifying growls that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the earth. It was a chaotic, terrifying symphony of violence, playing out in the darkness, leaving her blind and helpless. Then a hand, large and strong, grasped hers. It was his hand. She knew it instinctively, even though it felt different. Rougher, colder, almost scaled.
"Run,"
he commanded, his voice a guttural growl, barely recognizable. "Follow the wind." To the cathedral. He pushed her, propelling her forward into the darkness. She stumbled, her feet slipping on the snow-covered ground, but she regained her balance and ran. She ran as fast as she could, her lungs burning, her heart pounding in her chest, guided only by the force of the wind at her back, a chilling, yet strangely comforting presence. She didn't know where the cathedral was, had no visual landmarks to guide her, but she trusted him, implicitly, to lead her to safety. She ran blindly, through the narrow, winding streets of the abandoned village, the sounds of the fight fading behind her, replaced by the howling of the wind and the pounding of her own blood in her ears. She finally saw it, looming ahead of her, a dark, imposing silhouette against the slightly lighter sky. The cathedral. It was a ruin, its roof partially collapsed, its walls crumbling, but it still exuded an aura of ancient power, of sanctuary. She reached the entrance, a gaping hole where the massive wooden doors had once stood. She hesitated for a moment, peering into the darkness within, her senses on high alert. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only the echo of her own voice and the mournful sigh of the wind whistling through the broken, stained glass windows. She stepped inside, her eyes slowly adjusting to the gloom. The interior was vast and cavernous, the air cold and damp, filled with the scent of dust and decay. Moonlight streamed through the holes in the roof, illuminating crumbling pillars, shattered statues, and piles of rubble. It was a desolate, eerie place, yet Eowyn felt a strange sense of peace. A feeling of being sheltered, protected, despite the obvious dangers. It was as if the very stones of the cathedral were imbued with a protective energy, a remnant of the faith and devotion that had once filled this sacred space. She moved deeper into the cathedral, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She found a relatively sheltered alcove behind a partially collapsed pillar and huddled there, wrapping the heavy cloak tighter around her, trying to ward off the chill. She waited, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She didn't know what had happened to him, whether he had defeated the hunters, whether he was injured, or worse. The thought sent a wave of fear and grief through her. She had only known him for a short time, yet she felt a connection to him, a bond that was stronger than she could explain. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The wind howled outside, a mournful lament that echoed the turmoil in her soul. She closed her eyes, trying to calm her racing thoughts, trying to focus on the faint, flickering hope that he would return. She must have dozed, because she was startled awake by a sound. A soft, scraping sound coming from the entrance of the cathedral. She held her breath, her senses on high alert, her hand instinctively reaching for nothing. She had no weapon, no defense, other than the fledgling power that she barely understood. The sound came again, closer this time. And then, a figure emerged from the darkness, silhouetted against the faint moonlight. It was him. He was limping, his movements slow and labored. His clothes were torn, his fur cloak ripped and stained with blood. But he was alive. Eowyn scrambled to her feet, her heart leaping with relief. She rushed towards him, her arms outstretched. "Are you all right?" She reached for his arm, noticing the large gash, still seeping. He stared, and Eowyn saw not the silver of his eyes, but a darker, molten gold. Chapter 10. The warmth of a forbidden touch. The golden eyes, burning with an intensity that was both terrifying and mesmerizing, stared back at her. They were not the familiar silver she had come to associate with him, but something wilder, something more primal. It was as if the veneer of human control had been stripped away, revealing the creature of ice and shadow that lay beneath. Eowyn recoiled instinctively, a gasp escaping her lips. She took a step back, her hand still outstretched, hovering in the air between them. "What's wrong?" she whispered, her voice trembling, her gaze fixed on his transformed eyes. He blinked slowly, and the golden glow began to fade, replaced by the familiar silver, though it was now tinged with a residual amber, a flicker of the beast that still lurked within. I am fine," he said, his voice rough, strained, still carrying a hint of the guttural growl from earlier. He winced, his hand moving to his injured arm, the one Eowyn had noticed bleeding. She rushed forward, her fear momentarily forgotten in her concern for his well-being. "You're hurt," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and anxiety. "Let me see." He hesitated, his gaze flickering between her face and his injured arm. He seemed uncertain, almost vulnerable. It was a stark contrast to the powerful, intimidating presence he usually exuded. "It is nothing," he said, his voice still rough. "A scratch." Eowyn ignored his protest. She gently reached for his arm, her fingers brushing against the torn fabric of his tunic. The blood, dark and viscous, had soaked through the material, staining it a deep crimson. He flinched at her touch, a sharp intake of breath escaping his lips. It wasn't just pain, Eowyn realized. It was something else. A resistance. A fear of her. "Don't," he said, his voice low and urgent. You should not touch me. Not like this." Eowyn frowned, confused by his reaction. "Why not? You're hurt. I need to help you." He shook his head, his silver eyes filled with a turmoil she couldn't understand. "The transformation," he said, his voice strained. "It is not complete. I am not myself. I could hurt you." His words sent a shiver down Eowyn's spine. She understood now, the fear in his eyes. He wasn't afraid of her, but for her. He was afraid of losing control, of harming her with the wild, untamed power that still surged within him. But Eowyn refused to be afraid. She had seen the vulnerability beneath his icy exterior, the flicker of humanity that still remained, even in his transformed state. She trusted him, instinctively, to not harm her. "I'm not afraid," she said, her voice firm, her gaze meeting his. "I trust you." She gently took his arm again, her touch deliberate, unwavering. She ignored the faint tremor that ran through his body, the subtle resistance she felt in his muscles. She carefully peeled back the torn fabric of his tunic, revealing the wound beneath. It was a deep gash, running from his shoulder to his elbow, jagged and angry looking. The blood was still flowing, though not as profusely as before. Ioan's stomach churned at the sight, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had tended to minor injuries before in her life with Thomas, but nothing like this. This was a wound inflicted by a weapon, by violence, by the hunters who sought to destroy them. I need to clean it," she said, her voice a little shaky. "And bandage it." He nodded, his gaze fixed on her face, his eyes still holding a flicker of that unsettling golden glow. He seemed to be struggling to maintain control, to keep the beast at bay. Ioan looked around the alcove, searching for anything she could use. There was nothing, only rubble and dust and the remnants of broken furniture. She tore a strip of fabric from the hem of her own dress, the soft material a stark contrast to the rough, blood-stained tunic. She then looked at the wound, and gathering her will, she bent down and started to lick. He hissed. His entire body tensed. "What are you doing?" he growled, his voice thick and powerful. "Cleaning," she said calmly, though her insides churned. She continued, ignoring the metallic taste. He stood, rooted, the muscles of his body bunched. The conflict in his eyes, golden fading into silver as he struggled for control. He was a creature of two worlds, she realized, and her small act was driving them further apart. Or was it pulling them together? She had no idea. Chapter 11. Dreams of Fire and Ice. The act, so intimate and unexpected, hung in the air between them, a tangible tension that crackled with unspoken emotions. He remained frozen, his body rigid, his breathing ragged, his eyes a swirling mix of silver and gold, reflecting the internal battle raging within him. Ioan, finished with her task, gently wrapped the strip of fabric around his wound, securing it as best she could. The makeshift bandage, stark white against his tanned skin, and the dark, blood-soaked tunic, served as a visual reminder of the violence they had faced, of the vulnerability that lay beneath his powerful exterior. She looked up at him, her gaze searching his face for any sign of rejection, of disgust. But she found only confusion. And something else. A flicker of wonder. Why did you do that?" he asked, his voice still rough, but softer now, the guttural growl fading. Ioan shrugged, a little embarrassed by her own impulsive action. It needed to be cleaned," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And that was the only way." She didn't mention the instinctive urge that had driven her, the primal connection she felt to him, the desire to heal him, to ease his pain, even in such an unconventional, perhaps even foolish way. He didn't say anything, just stared at her, his eyes still searching, questioning. The silence stretched, broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind whistling through the broken windows of the cathedral. Ioan, feeling suddenly exposed, vulnerable, turned away from his intense gaze. She moved back to the alcove, huddling beneath the heavy cloak, trying to ward off the chill that seemed to have settled deep within her bones. He followed her, slowly, his movements still a little stiff, a little uncertain. He sat down beside her, not too close, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, a warmth that seemed to defy the icy nature of his power. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and sincere, "for tending to my wound, and for not being afraid." Ioan looked at him, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his eyes. She reached out, her hand hovering over his, hesitant to touch him, still unsure of his reaction. "I told you," she said, her voice soft. "I trust you." He met her gaze, and this time, there was no resistance, no fear. Only acceptance. And something else. A flicker of gratitude. He allowed her to take his hand, his fingers still slightly rough, slightly cold, intertwining with hers. The contact sent a jolt of warmth through her, a comforting sensation that eased the lingering fear and anxiety. They sat in silence for a long time, their hands clasped together, their gazes fixed on the flickering shadows cast by the moonlight streaming through the broken windows. It was a strange, surreal moment, a moment of peace and intimacy in the midst of chaos and danger. Eowyn eventually drifted off to sleep, exhausted by the events of the night, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm a protective presence around her. She dreamed. She dreamed of fire and ice, of swirling winds and frozen landscapes. She dreamed of a woman with long, flowing white hair, holding a staff of ice, her silver eyes filled with both power and sorrow. Lyra, the first Frostborn. She dreamed of a wolf, running through a snow-covered forest, its fur the color of freshly fallen snow, its eyes burning with a golden glow. The wolf was him. She knew it instinctively, even though she had never seen him transform. She dreamed of a battle, a clash of steel and ice, of men fighting against creatures of myth and legend. She saw herself, standing amidst the chaos, wielding a power she didn't understand, a power that was both terrifying and exhilarating. She dreamed of a kiss, a touch of lips, cold yet burning, a fusion of fire and ice, a promise of something more. She woke with a start, her heart pounding, her body covered in a cold sweat. The dream, so vivid, so real, lingered in her mind, leaving her breathless and disoriented. He was still asleep, his arms still around her, his breathing slow and even. The first rays of dawn were beginning to filter through the broken windows, casting a pale, ethereal light over the ruined cathedral. Eowyn carefully disentangled herself from his embrace, not wanting to wake him. She stood up, stretching her stiff muscles, her gaze lingering on his sleeping form. He looked peaceful, his features relaxed, the harsh lines of his face softened by sleep. He looked younger. She wrapped the cloak tighter around her, feeling a sudden chill, despite the warmth of his body that still lingered on her skin. The dream, the kiss, the promise it had unsettled her, awakened a longing within her that she hadn't known existed. A longing for him. She turned away, her heart aching with a confusion of emotions. She needed to understand, to make sense of the dream, of the power that flowed within her, of the feelings that were beginning to stir, feelings that were both dangerous and irresistible. As the sun continued to rise, she quietly left, determined to find what she needed. Chapter 12. The Price of Protection. The early morning air was crisp and cold, biting at Eowyn's exposed skin as she stepped out of the cathedral. The abandoned village of Aliana, shrouded in a thin layer of mist, looked even more desolate in the pale dawn light. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional caw of a raven and the crunch of her boots on the snow-covered ground. She walked aimlessly for a while, her mind still reeling from the dream, from the intensity of the emotions it had evoked. She needed to find a place to think, to process, to understand. She found herself drawn to the small, frozen-over well she had seen the day before, the one with the carved stone marker. She sat down on the edge of the well, her gaze fixed on the inscription, the words in the ancient language of the Frostborn that she somehow understood. Here lies the heart of Aliana. May its spirit endure. The words resonated with her, with a sense of loss and resilience that permeated this place. She felt a connection to Aliana, to its lost inhabitants, to their struggle for survival, to their legacy. She closed her eyes, letting the cold air wash over her, trying to clear her mind, to focus. She needed to understand her power, the mark of the Frostborn, the connection she felt to him. She reached out, instinctively, touching the icy surface of the well. The contact sent a jolt of energy through her, a familiar sensation of cold and awakening. And then she saw it, a vision, flickering before her closed eyes, like images projected onto a screen. She saw Aliana, not as it was now, but as it had been. A thriving village, filled with life and laughter. She saw people, Frostborn, their silver eyes shining with vitality, their faces filled with joy and camaraderie. She saw children playing in the snow, their laughter echoing through the streets. She saw families gathered around hearth fires, sharing stories, sharing love. She saw him, younger, his features less harsh, his eyes filled with a lightness that was absent now. He was surrounded by friends, by family, by a woman. A woman with long, dark hair and laughing eyes, her hand clasped in his, a silver ring on her finger, matching one on his. A wave of jealousy washed over Eowyn, a sharp, unexpected pang that made her heart ache. She knew, instinctively, that this woman was his wife, his love,
his past.
The vision shifted abruptly. The joy and laughter were gone, replaced by fear and chaos. She saw the hunters, attacking the village, their weapons glinting in the firelight. She saw the Frostborn, fighting back, their powers unleashed, their faces contorted with rage and despair. She saw him, fighting fiercely, protecting his people, protecting his wife. But he was outnumbered, overwhelmed. She saw his wife, struck down by a hunter's arrow, her body falling to the ground, her lifeblood staining the snow crimson. She saw him, cradling her in his arms, his face a mask of grief and rage. He let out a roar of anguish, a sound that echoed through the ages, a sound that resonated with the primal power of the north wind. Eowyn gasped, her eyes snapping open, her body trembling. The vision, so vivid, so real, had left her breathless and shaken. She understood. Now, the sadness in his eyes, the bitterness in his voice, the price of protection. He had lost everything. His home, his people, his love. He had been protecting his wife, just like he was now protecting her. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was not his love, not his destiny. She was a replacement, a substitute, a reminder of what he had lost. A tear escaped her eye, freezing on her cheek. The cold, which had always been a source of comfort, now felt like a burden, a weight that pressed down on her, crushing her spirit. She stood up, her legs unsteady, her heart aching with a pain she couldn't name. She needed to get away, to escape the weight of his past, of her own illusions. She started to walk away, and her foot hit something. It was a small, carved wooden figure that had been hidden under the snow. She lifted it and brushed away the ice. It was a wolf. She turned it around and around in her hand, remembering her dream, remembering how it had looked at her. She heard his footsteps, and before she could hide the wolf, he appeared. His eyes rested on the carving, and Eowyn saw the pain cross his face. He didn't speak. He simply looked. Chapter 13. Unveiling the Ancient Curse. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable, punctuated only by the sighing of the wind. The carved wolf, held tightly in Eowyn's hand, served as a tangible symbol of the unspoken grief, the shared history that lay between them. His gaze, fixed on the small wooden figure, held a depth of sadness that made Eowyn's heart ache. She wanted to say something, to offer comfort, to bridge the chasm that had opened up between them. But the words caught in her throat, trapped by the weight of her own confused emotions, by the realization of the substitute she had become. He finally broke the silence, his voice rough and strained. That was hers, he said, his gaze never leaving the wolf. A gift.
From me.
Eowyn's fingers tightened around the carving, the wood digging into her palm. She felt a pang of guilt for intruding on his memories, for stirring up the pain that he had so carefully buried. "I am sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I didn't know." He shook his head, his gaze finally shifting to meet hers. His silver eyes, usually so intense, were now clouded with a vulnerability that made her breath catch in her throat. "It is not your fault," he said, his voice low. "The past, it is always with us. A shadow that never truly fades." He took a step closer, his hand reaching out, not to touch her, but to touch the wolf. His fingers, long and elegant, brushed against the carved wood, tracing the outline of the animal's form. Her name was Lyra, he said, repeating the name Eowyn had heard in her vision, the name of the first Frostborn. But this Lyra, this was his Lyra. She was like you, he continued, his voice a little hesitant, as if he were unsure of how to express himself.
Strong, kind, brave.
She brought light into my life, a warmth that I had never known. His words, spoken with such tenderness, sent a fresh wave of pain through Eowyn. She knew he wasn't comparing her to his lost love, not intentionally. But the implication was there, unavoidable. She was a reminder, a pale imitation, of the woman he had truly loved. And the curse, she asked, her voice soft, wanting to change his focus. And hers, the curse of the Frostborn, what is its nature? He sighed, his gaze shifting away from the wolf, back to the distant, snow-covered mountains. It is a story as old as time itself, he said, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller, reciting an ancient legend. A tale of love and loss, of power and betrayal, of a pact made with the north wind. He began to walk, slowly, towards the ruins of a nearby building, its walls crumbling, its roof long gone. Eowyn followed him, drawn by his words, by the need to understand, to unravel the mystery of her own heritage. Lyra, the first Frostborn, he continued, his voice echoing in the silence, was not born with her power. She acquired it. She made a bargain with the north wind, a desperate plea for strength, for survival. She offered herself, her soul, in exchange for power. Power that saved her people from a great calamity, he said. A terrible drought that threatened to extinguish all life in these lands. The north wind granted her wish, he said, but at a price. The power came with conditions. The Frostborn would be forever bound to the cold, to the ice, to the isolation. They would be feared, hunted, misunderstood. They would be different. He paused, staring at the ground. And Eowyn began quietly. There was something more, wasn't there? A deeper price? He turned to her, and the agony in his eyes confirmed what she already knew. Love, he finally whispered. True love could never form. He closed his eyes, and a tear escaped, running a slow path down his face. It froze. Chapter 14. The Betrayal of Trust. The revelation hung in the air, heavy and chilling, more profound than the icy wind that whipped around them. Love, true love could never form. The words echoed in Eowyn's mind, a devastating confirmation of her deepest fears, a cruel twist of fate that shattered any lingering hope she might have harbored. She looked at him, at the man who had brought her to this desolate place, who had awakened her power, who had claimed her. She saw the pain in his eyes, the weight of his past, the burden of the ancient curse. And she understood, with a sickening clarity, the true nature of their bond. It was not love. It could never be love. It was a connection forged in necessity, in shared heritage, in mutual loneliness. It was a pact made in ice, a destiny dictated by the whims of a cruel and capricious god. A wave of bitterness washed over Eowyn, a resentment that she hadn't realized she was harboring. She had been so focused on understanding her power, on adapting to this new world, that she had ignored the warning signs, the subtle hints of impossibility. You knew, she said, her voice trembling, not with cold, but with anger. You knew about the curse. And you didn't tell me. He didn't deny it. He simply looked at her, his silver eyes filled with a mixture of regret and resignation. I was going to, he said, his voice low and strained. But there was never a good time. And I hoped he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Eowyn knew what he had hoped. He had hoped that she would be different, that she would be the exception, that she would break the curse, that she would love him. The foolishness of his hope, the cruelty of it, made her anger flare even brighter. You used me, she said, her voice rising, her hands clenching into fists. You brought me here, knowing that we could never be, that I could never. She couldn't bring herself to say the word love. It felt too painful, too real. He took a step back, his face paling, his eyes widening in alarm. No, he said, his voice urgent. That is not true. I care for you, Eowyn.
Deeply.
But it's not love, she finished for him, her voice laced with a bitterness that surprised even her. It's convenience. It's protection. It's a lie. She turned away from him, her heart aching with a pain that was far more profound than any physical wound. She had been betrayed, not by malice, but by hope, by his desperate desire to escape the loneliness of his existence, by her own foolish yearning for connection. "I need to leave," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I need to go home." She started to walk away, her footsteps crunching on the snow-covered ground, her mind racing, her heart breaking. She didn't know where she was going, how she would get back to Havenwood, but she knew she couldn't stay here, not anymore. He didn't try to stop her, physically, but his voice, filled with a desperation she hadn't heard before, followed her. "Owen, wait," he called out. "Please, do not do this. You are not safe alone." The hunter, she stopped, her back to him, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. "I'd rather face the hunters," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Then face this. Then face you." She didn't wait for his reply. She started running, blindly, through the abandoned village, the wind whipping her hair around her face, the tears freezing on her cheeks. She ran until she could run no more, until her lungs burned, until her legs ached, until she collapsed, exhausted and heartbroken in the snow. She lay there, curled up in a ball, the cold seeping into her bones, mirroring the emptiness in her heart. She had lost everything. Her home, her past, her future. She was alone, truly alone, in a world that was both terrifying and cruel. She heard the howl then. A long, mournful sound that echoed through the valley, filled with a pain that mirrored her own. It was his voice. She knew it instinctively, transformed, amplified, imbued with the primal power of the north wind. It was a cry of anguish, of despair, of loss. And in that moment, lying there in the snow, Eowyn realized that she was not the only one who had been betrayed. He had betrayed himself as well. Chapter 15.
A heart bound by ice.
The mournful howl, echoing through the desolate valley, pierced Eowyn's heart, a stark reminder of the shared pain, the mutual betrayal that bound them together. She lay there, in the snow, her body numb with cold, her mind reeling from the devastating truth she had uncovered. She had accused him of using her, of deceiving her, of lying. But she realized, with a sickening clarity, that she had also been deceiving herself. She had allowed herself to be swept away by the fantasy, by the allure of the unknown, by the attraction she felt for him. She had ignored the warning signs, the subtle hints of impossibility, blinded by her own desperate yearning for connection. She had wanted to believe in the dream, in the possibility of a new life, of a love that could defy the ancient curse. But the truth was inescapable. Love, true love, was forbidden to them. Their bond, forged in ice, was destined to remain frozen. She slowly sat up, her body aching, her spirit crushed. The wind whipped around her, a cruel reminder of the harsh reality she faced. She looked back towards a village, towards the place where she had left him, towards the source of the heart-wrenching howl. She knew she couldn't go back. Not yet. She needed time, space, to process, to heal. But she also knew she couldn't stay here, exposed and vulnerable, in the heart of the Whisperwind Valley. She forced herself to stand, her legs unsteady, her body trembling. She needed to find shelter, to find strength. She needed to survive. She started walking, aimlessly at first, then with a growing sense of purpose. She didn't know where she was going, but she trusted her instincts, the newly awakened power within her, to guide her. She walked for hours, the landscape blurring around her, a seemingly endless expanse of snow and ice. The sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the valley, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. She finally found it. A small cave, hidden behind a cluster of snow-covered rocks, barely visible from a distance. It was not much, but it offered a measure of protection from the wind, from the cold, from the hunters. She crawled inside, the space cramped and damp, but relatively sheltered. She huddled there, wrapping the heavy cloak tighter around her, trying to ward off the chill that seemed to have settled deep within her bones. She closed her eyes, exhaustion finally overcoming her. She drifted off to sleep, her dreams filled with images of ice and snow, of silver eyes and mournful howls, of a love that could never be. She woke with a start, her heart pounding, her body covered in a cold sweat. The dream, so vivid, so real, lingered in her mind, a cruel reminder of the reality she faced. She sat up, her head brushing against the low ceiling of the cave. The first rays of dawn were beginning to filter through the entrance, casting a pale, ethereal light over the interior.
She heard a sound then.
A soft, crunching sound coming from outside the cave. She held her breath, her senses on high alert, her hand instinctively reaching for nothing. She had no weapon, no defense, other than the fledgling power that she still didn't understand. The sound came again, closer this time. And then, a figure appeared in the entrance of the cave, silhouetted against the faint light. It was him. He stood there for a moment, his gaze searching the darkness within. He looked tired, his features drawn, his silver eyes filled with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "On," he said, his voice low and strained. "Are you all right?" She didn't answer, her gaze fixed on his face, her heart a tangled mess of conflicting emotions. Anger, resentment, betrayal, but also a flicker of something else. Something she couldn't quite name, something she didn't want to acknowledge. He took a step closer, his hand reaching out, hesitant to touch her. I was worried," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I thought. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Yoan knew what he had thought. He had thought she was gone, lost, captured, dead. I needed time," she said, her voice finally breaking the silence, her tone cold and distant. "To think." He nodded, his gaze understanding, accepting. "I know," he said, his voice soft. "And I am sorry. For everything." The apology, spoken with such sincerity, disarmed her. She had expected him to be angry, defensive, even hostile. But he was vulnerable, and that vulnerability, more than anything else, broke through her defenses, chipped away at the icy wall she had erected around her heart. He looked at her, and his face softened. "Come," he said. "Let's get out of here, my love." Chapter 16. The Gathering Storm. The words, "my love," slipped out, unguarded and raw, hanging in the cold air of the cave like a fragile icicle, beautiful and precarious. Yoan's breath caught in her throat. It was the first time he had used such an endearment, and the stark contrast between the phrase and the reality of their cursed bond was almost unbearable. She looked at him, her eyes searching his, trying to decipher the meaning behind the words. Was it a slip of the tongue? A moment of weakness? Or something more? His gaze met hers, unwavering, and she saw a flicker of something in the depths of his silver eyes. Not love, not in the way she understood it, not in the way that was forbidden to them, but affection.
Care.
A deep, abiding connection that transcended the limitations of their curse. She didn't say anything, her heart too full, too confused to respond. She simply nodded, accepting his unspoken apology, accepting him. He reached out, his hand gently taking hers, his touch sending a familiar warmth through her chilled body. He helped her to her feet, his grip strong and reassuring. They left the cave, stepping out into the crisp morning air. The sun, now fully risen, cast a golden glow over the snow-covered landscape, transforming the desolate valley into a scene of breathtaking beauty. Where are we going?" Yoan asked, her voice a little hesitant, still unsure of her place in this relationship, in this world. "Back to the village," he replied, his voice low and steady. "It is not safe to be out in the open. The hunters, they will be searching for us." Yoan nodded, her heart pounding with a renewed sense of fear. The threat of the hunters, which had receded into the background during her emotional turmoil, was now once again a tangible, immediate danger. They walked in silence for a while, their pace quick and purposeful, their senses on high alert. The wind whipped around them, carrying with it the scent of snow and pine, and something else. Something ominous, something unsettling. "There is something wrong," he said, his voice suddenly tense, his gaze scanning the surrounding landscape. "I can feel it." Eowyn felt it too. A shift in the air, a change in the energy, a sense of foreboding. It was as if the very elements were warning them of an impending danger, a gathering storm. They reached the outskirts of the village, the ruined buildings looming ahead of them, silent and watchful. The smoke that had curled from a few of the chimneys the day before was gone, extinguished. The village felt empty, deserted, even more desolate than before. "They've been here," he said, his voice grim, his hand reaching for the large, silver knife that was sheathed at his side. "And they're close." Eowyn's heart pounded in her chest. She knew, instinctively, that this was not just a random patrol, a chance encounter. This was an ambush. A trap. They moved cautiously, staying close to the shadows, their eyes scanning the rooftops, the windows, the narrow alleyways. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the wind and the occasional creak of a weathered sign. Suddenly, he stopped, his body tensing, his gaze fixed on a building across the street. It was the one where he had stayed, the one with the intricately carved wooden door. The door was open. A sliver of darkness in the otherwise bright morning light. "They're inside," he whispered, his voice tight with anger and fear. "Waiting for us." Eowyn's breath caught in her throat. She knew what he was thinking. They were trapped, outnumbered, outgunned. But she also knew that they couldn't give up. They had to fight. For their survival. For their future. Whatever that future might hold. He turned to her, his silver eyes burning with an intensity she had never seen before. "Owen," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You need to use your power.
Now.
It is our only chance." She stared at him, her mind blank. Use her powers? What power?
How?
He took both of her hands.
Focus.
A shower of arrows rained down, and the fight was on. Chapter 17. Sacrifices in the Moonlight. The sudden barrage of arrows, whistling through the air like deadly insects, shattered the tense silence. Eowyn gasped, instinctively ducking, pulling him down with her behind the crumbling wall of a ruined building. The arrows thudded into the wood and stone around them, a terrifying reminder of the imminent danger. "Focus," he repeated, his voice urgent, his grip tightening on her hands. "Remember the well. Remember the vision. Remember the ice." His words, spoken with such intensity, pierced through her fear, sparking a flicker of understanding. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the chaos around them, trying to focus on the memory of the vision, on the feeling of the cold, on the power that she knew, instinctively, lay dormant within her. She felt it then, a tingling sensation, starting in her fingertips, spreading through her arms, her chest, her entire body. It was a cold, yes, but also a warmth, a power, surging within her, waiting to be unleashed. I don't know how," she whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes still closed. "Trust yourself," he said, his voice a low murmur, his breath warm against her ear. "Trust your instincts. Let it flow." She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart, trying to focus on the feeling of the cold, on the image of the ice, on the power. She opened her eyes, and the world seemed different.
Sharper. Clearer.
She could see the individual snowflakes swirling in the wind, the glint of sunlight on the metal arrowheads, the grim determination on the faces of the hunters who were now emerging from the building across the street. She raised her hand, instinctively, towards the approaching hunters. And she willed it. A wave of ice, shimmering and ethereal, erupted from her outstretched hand, spreading outwards like a ripple in a pond. It was not a solid wall of ice, but rather a mist, a freezing fog, that engulfed the hunters, slowing their advance, obscuring their vision. They cried out in surprise and alarm, their movements becoming sluggish, their weapons slipping from their grasp as their hands froze. It was working. Her power, unleashed, was effective. But it was also draining. Eowyn felt a weakness spreading through her limbs, a dizziness that made her sway on her feet. She knew she couldn't maintain this for long. He saw her weakening, his eyes filled with concern. He drew his silver knife, his body tensing, ready to defend her, to protect her, even at the cost of his own life. "Keep going," he urged, his voice low and strained. "Just a little longer." She nodded, her teeth chattering, her body trembling with the effort. She focused all her remaining energy, all her will, on maintaining the icy mist, on holding the hunters at bay. But it wasn't enough. One of the hunters, larger and stronger than the others, managed to break free from the freezing fog, his crossbow raised, his aim steady. He fired. Eowyn saw the arrow coming, a blur of metal and wood, heading straight for him. She screamed, a wordless cry of terror and desperation.
She didn't think.
She didn't hesitate. She moved. She threw herself in front of him, shielding his body with her own, the arrow finding its mark in her shoulder. The pain was excruciating, a searing fire that ripped through her flesh, stealing her breath. She gasped, her knees buckling, her vision blurring. He caught her, his arms wrapping around her, holding her close. His face was a mask of horror and rage.
"No,"
he roared, his voice filled with a primal anguish that echoed through the abandoned village. He looked at her, his silver eyes burning with a furious intensity. He gently touched the arrow protruding from her shoulder, his fingers trembling. "Eowyn, why?" he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. She looked at him, her vision fading, her body numb with pain. She smiled, a weak, trembling smile. "Because," she whispered, her voice barely audible, she couldn't finish the sentence. She couldn't say the word love. It was forbidden. It was impossible. But she didn't need to. He knew. He saw it in her eyes, in her sacrifice, in her heart. He cradled her in his arms, his tears freezing on her cheeks. The hunters were forgotten, the battle lost, the world fading away. The only thing that mattered was her. As her eyes started to close, his did too. He held her closer, the tears now mixed with blood. Chapter 18. The Frostborn's Legacy. The world dissolved into a swirling vortex of white and gray, of pain and cold. Eowyn felt herself slipping away, drifting towards an unknown horizon, a place where the ancient curse, the burden of her heritage, the heartbreak would finally cease to exist. She felt his arms around her, his body a shield against the encroaching darkness. She heard his voice, a muffled roar of anguish and despair, calling her name, pleading with her to stay. But she was too tired, too weak, to resist the pull, the release. And then she felt it, a surge of energy, not her own, but his. It was a warmth, yes, but a warmth infused with the cold, a strange, paradoxical sensation that spread through her body, chasing away the numbness, the pain, the darkness. It was his power, his life force, flowing into her, a desperate attempt to heal her, to save her, to keep her. She gasped, her eyes snapping open, her vision blurry, her body trembling. She was still in his arms, cradled against his chest, his face buried in her hair. He was changing. She could feel it, see it, sense it. His body was becoming larger, stronger, his skin rougher, colder, his features shifting, transforming. He was becoming the wolf, the creature of ice and shadow that lurked beneath his human exterior. The transformation was not complete, not yet. He was still him, but also something else. Something wild, something primal, something terrifying. But Eowyn was not afraid. She had seen the beast before, in her dreams, in his eyes. And she knew, instinctively, that it was not a monster, but a protector,
a guardian,
a lover. He raised his head, his eyes burning with a golden glow, no longer silver, but the color of molten fire. He looked at her, his gaze intense, unwavering, filled with a mixture of relief and desperation. "Eowyn," he growled, his voice a guttural rumble, barely human. "You live." She nodded, her voice too weak to speak. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched his face, her fingers tracing the outline of his cheekbone, now sharper, more defined, covered in a fine layer of fur. He flinched at her touch, a flicker of fear in his golden eyes. He was afraid of hurting her, of losing control of the beast. But she didn't pull away. She held his gaze, her eyes filled with acceptance. And something more. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I trust you." Her words, spoken with such simple sincerity, seemed to break through his fear, his resistance. The golden glow in his eyes faded slightly, replaced by a flicker of recognition, of love. He lowered his head, his snout, now elongated and covered in fur, nuzzling against her cheek. He licked her face, his tongue rough but gentle, a primal gesture of affection. The hunters. Yoan suddenly remembered. The danger. The fight. She tried to sit up, her body protesting with a sharp stab of pain. We need to go," she said, her voice weak but urgent. They will be back." He understood. He carefully helped her to her feet, his body supporting hers, his strength a reassuring presence. He looked around, his senses on high alert, his golden eyes scanning the surrounding landscape. The village was silent, deserted, the hunters gone. "They fled," he growled, his voice still rough, but tinged with a hint of satisfaction. "They fear the wolf." He started to walk, slowly, carefully, guiding her toward somewhere. She didn't know where, but she trusted him, implicitly, to lead her to safety. As they walked, he began to change again, slowly, gradually, returning to his human form. The fur receded, his features softened, his eyes returned to their familiar silver, though they still held a flicker of the golden glow, a reminder of the beast that still lurked within. The transformation was complete, but the connection remained. A bond forged in ice and fire, in sacrifice and love. A love that was forbidden, that was impossible, yet existed. They continued past all of the huts, and he continued to walk toward the mountains. "Where?" she finally managed to say, her voice hoarse. "To Lyra," he replied. Chapter 19. The Rebirth of Hope. The journey to Lyra's resting place was arduous, a steep climb up the snow-covered slopes of the mountain. Yoan, still weak from her injury, leaned heavily on him, his strength a constant source of support and reassurance. The air grew thinner, colder, with each step, but she didn't complain. She was driven by a need to reach their destination, to understand the legacy of the first Frostborn, to find a way forward. He, too, was silent, his gaze fixed on the path ahead, his mind seemingly preoccupied. He was still carrying the weight of his past, the burden of the ancient curse, the responsibility for her injury. But there was also something else in his eyes, a flicker of hope. A hope that she had ignited, with her sacrifice, with her love. They finally reached it. A small, secluded clearing, nestled amidst a cluster of ancient, snow-covered pines. In the center of the clearing stood a single, imposing monolith of ice, taller than any man, shimmering with an ethereal blue light. It was not a natural formation, but a sculpture. A tomb. This was Lyra's resting place. The place where the first Frostborn had been laid to rest, centuries ago. The place where the power of the North Wind, the source of their curse and their gift, resided. Yoan stood before the ice monolith, her breath catching in her throat. She felt a strange connection to this place, to this woman, to this power. It was as if the very air around her was vibrating with an ancient energy, a whisper of the past, a promise of the future. He stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the ice, his expression unreadable. He had been here before, many times, seeking solace, seeking answers, seeking a way to break the curse. But he had always come alone. Now he was here with her. And that, Yoan realized, made all the difference. She sacrificed herself, he said, his voice low and strained, breaking the silence.
To save her people. Just like you.
Yoan nodded, her gaze never leaving the ice. She understood, now, the true meaning of sacrifice. It was not about giving up, but about giving. Giving everything you have, everything you are, for something greater. For someone you love. But he continued, his voice hesitant. Her sacrifice, it came with a price. The curse. The isolation. The loss. He turned to her, his silver eyes filled with a mixture of regret and hope. I do not want that for you, Eowyn. I do not want you to be alone. To be cursed. She reached out, her hand gently touching his cheek. His skin was cold, but she felt the warmth beneath, the flicker of the human heart that beat within the creature of ice and shadow. It's too late, she said, her voice soft but firm. I am already frostborn. I am already marked. I am already yours. The word yours hung in the air, heavy with implication. It was not a declaration of ownership, but of belonging, of connection, of love. A love that defied the curse, that transcended the limitations of their heritage, that existed, despite everything. He closed his eyes, a single tear freezing on his cheek. He knew she was right. It was too late. They were bound together, by fate, by destiny, by love. He opened his eyes, and she saw a change in his gaze. The sadness was still there, the regret, the burden. But there was also something else. A strength, a determination, a hope. Then we will face it together, he said, his voice firm, his hand covering hers. We will find a way. To live. To love. To break the curse. His words, spoken with such conviction, sent a surge of warmth through Eowyn, chasing away the lingering fear, the doubt, the despair. She knew it wouldn't be easy. The curse was ancient, powerful, deeply ingrained in their very being. But she also knew that they were not alone. They had each other, and they had hope. He looked toward the monolith. It is time, he said. He stepped forward, Eowyn beside him. They held out their hands together toward Lyra, and the ice began to melt. Chapter 20. The Thaw of a Frozen Heart. The ice, ancient and seemingly impervious, began to melt. Not gradually, not subtly, but with a dramatic, almost violent, release of energy. Water, pure and crystalline, streamed down the sides of the monolith, forming small pools on the snow-covered ground. The air crackled with power, a tangible force that made Eowyn's hair stand on end, that made her skin tingle with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. He stood beside her, his hand still clasped in hers, his body tense, his gaze fixed on the melting ice. He was afraid. Eowyn could feel it, in the tremor of his hand, in the rapid beat of his heart, in the uncertainty in his eyes. He didn't know what would happen, what would be unleashed when the ice was gone. But he was also hopeful. He believed, with a desperate, unwavering conviction, that this was the way to break the curse, to free themselves from the shackles of their past, to live, to love. The melting accelerated, the ice cracking and groaning, as if in protest, as if in pain. The air grew warmer, surprisingly so, a stark contrast to the frigid cold that had always surrounded them. It was as if the very essence of the north wind, the source of their power and their curse, was being released. And then it was gone. The ice monolith, which had stood for centuries, a symbol of the Frostborn's legacy, had vanished, leaving behind only a small, crystal-clear pool of water, reflecting the bright morning sky. In the center of the pool, something stirred. Eowyn gasped, her eyes widening in surprise and awe. It was a flower, a single, perfect bloom, unlike anything she had ever seen before. Its petals were the color of the purest ice, shimmering with an ethereal blue light, yet they radiated a warmth that defied logic, that defied nature. It was a frost bloom, the legendary flower of the Frostborn, said to possess the power to heal, to restore, to break the curse. He stared at the flower, his breath catching in his throat. He had heard the legends, of course, but he had never truly believed them. He had thought they were just stories. Fairy tales. But now, here it was in front of him, real and tangible. He reached out, his hand trembling, and gently plucked the flower from the pool. The moment his fingers touched the petals, a surge of energy pulsed through him, through Eowyn, through the very air around them. It was a warmth, yes, but a warmth infused with a cold, a strange, paradoxical sensation that made their hearts race, that made their bodies tingle, that made their souls sing. He looked at Eowyn, his silver eyes filled with a mixture of wonder and love. A love that was no longer forbidden, no longer impossible, but real.
True.
Unconditional. It worked, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. The curse is broken. Eowyn nodded, her own eyes filled with tears of joy and relief. She felt it, too. The change. The release. The freedom. The curse was gone. He held out the frost bloom, offering it to her. This is for you, he said, his voice soft and tender. A symbol of our new beginning. Of our love. She took the flower, her fingers brushing against his, the contact sending a jolt of warmth through her, a warmth that was no longer tinged with cold, but pure and unadulterated. She brought the flower to her lips, inhaling its delicate, ethereal fragrance. It smelled of snow and ice, of pine and wind, of hope. She looked at him, her heart overflowing with a love that she had never thought possible. A love that had defied the odds, that had conquered the curse, that had transformed them both. He smiled, a slow, captivating smile that reached his eyes, that transformed his face, that made her heart soar. It was a smile that promised a future filled with warmth, with joy, with love. He leaned down, his lips gently touching hers, a kiss that was both tender and passionate, a kiss that sealed their bond, a kiss that melted the last vestiges of the frozen heart. They stayed there on the mountaintop, together. The frost was gone, the air was warm, and they had each other. Epilogue. The journey back to Havenwood was a journey of transformation, not just for Eowyn and him, but for the world around them. The unnatural frost that had gripped the land, the harbinger of his arrival and her awakening, had receded, leaving behind a landscape that was both familiar and new. The roses in Eowyn's garden, once encased in ice, now bloomed with an unprecedented vibrancy, their petals unfurling in a riot of color, their fragrance filling the air with a sweetness that was almost intoxicating. The air, once heavy with the promise of an eternal winter, now thrummed with the warmth of a late summer, a summer that had been delayed, but not denied. They returned to her cottage, hand in hand, their steps light, their hearts filled with a joy that neither had dared to dream of. The house, which had once felt like a repository of memories, a reminder of a past life, now felt like home. A place of new beginnings, of shared futures, of love. The silver locket, which Eowyn had worn for so long, a symbol of her devotion to Thomas, no longer felt like a chain, binding her to the past. She still treasured it, of course, as a reminder of the love she had known, but it no longer defined her. She was no longer just Eowyn Aldrich, widow of Havenwood. She was Owen, the Frostborn, beloved of he still did not have a name she knew. And he, the nameless one, the creature of ice and shadow, had also been transformed. The harsh lines of his face had softened, the sadness in his eyes had been replaced by a light, a warmth, that radiated from within. He was still powerful, still protective, still a wolf at heart. But he was also human, vulnerable, loving. They spent their days rediscovering the simple joys of life, the warmth of the sun on their skin, the taste of fresh food, the laughter of neighbors. The people of Havenwood, who had once viewed Eowyn with a mixture of curiosity and pity, now welcomed them both with open arms, sensing the change in her, sensing the love that radiated from them both. They rebuilt the abandoned village in the valley, creating a true home. They planted trees and flowers, and the land responded. They traveled, too. They saw many places, many things. One evening, as they sat on the porch of her cottage, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Eowyn turned to him, a question in her eyes. You never told me your name," she said, her voice soft, her hand gently touching his. He smiled, a slow, captivating smile that reached his eyes, that made her heart flutter. He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. My name, he said, his voice a low murmur, is Lorcan. Eowyn repeated the name, savoring the sound of it, the feel of it on her tongue.
Lorcan, she said.
It suits you. He leaned down, his lips brushing against hers, a kiss that was both tender and passionate, a kiss that sealed their bond, a kiss that promised forever. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Eowyn knew that their journey, their love, their life had just begun. They held each other, surrounded by the flowers of summer and the whispering wind, now gentle, told of a future bright and long.